So my name is K Lauer. I am a proposal manager out of the Research Development Unit in KED, the Knowledge Enterprise Development. And I've spent a lot of time over the last year working on USAID proposals. For those of you here in the room, as I go through content, I have about 30 to 40 minutes of content. If you have questions throughout, feel free to raise your hand and we can address them during the presentation. For folks online, if you want to just type your questions into the chat box, LJ will be reporting your questions out here in the room. And then I'll leave plenty of time at the end where we can do some more Q&A and discussion on topics that people want to dive into. Okay, so as I said, I'm with Research Development. Our website is funding.asu.edu. You can find a lot of our content there. This is the last workshop in a series of workshops that we call Proposal Development Workshops. These are the different topics that we've covered this fall. We will likely be hosting these again next year, and then I'll talk about some events that are coming up this spring that you might be interested in attending as well at the end of the presentation. Okay, hopefully all of you found this event through Research Academy. I just want to plug it again here. This is where you can find different research training workshops and sign up for them. And then we always want to point to the Research Administration website as you are preparing proposals. You do want to constantly refer to this website. There's a lot of resources here for you to tap into. Okay, so what we're going to cover today, we're going to be talking about positioning your team before the solicitation even goes live. We're going to talk about parsing and breaking down a USAID solicitation. We're going to talk about common technical application proposal sections and what goes in those. We're going to talk about some considerations for cost applications, and then I'm going to point you to some resources, both here at ASU and on the USAID website as well. Okay, so just to dive in, we want to talk about positioning your team. How do you get from here in Tempe, Arizona, to actually implementing a project abroad under USAID funding? So we want to tell you that writing your proposal is not the first step here. So I'm going to go through a few resources that you can start learning more about USAID, learning about what they're funding and where they're funding it, and tracking opportunities about 6 months to a year in advance. Some of these I did review in the first USAID presentation, and we will send out the PowerPoint afterwards for both the first presentation and this presentation, so you'll have all of the slides when I reference stuff from the first presentation. So first of all, you can go to the mission websites. These are all listed on the USAID website. It's a good thing to click through. You're going to get information about what they're funding, past and current projects, so you can get a sense of what their priorities in the country are. You can also look at their 5-year strategic plans. All of the ones that are published are going to be housed on the website, on the USAID website, and you can click through and they're going to let you know over the next 5 years where are they going to allocate their funding. So if you want to do a project in health in Ukraine, but you go to the Ukrainian strategic plan and they are not funding projects in health, you know that that's not going to be a possibility for the next 5 years. Okay, you can also take a look at the USAID business forecast. This used to be updated quarterly. They now update it on an ongoing basis. You can either search through the web search portal, or you can also download the entire thing as an Excel sheet and sort it yourself. They're going to post different award opportunities that are going to be coming out with varying levels of detail that you can track, and when they update those, they'll let you know that there's an update to when that's going to come out or the funding amount, etc. All right, the next piece of positioning your team is planning ahead. So here, there's a lot of things to think about when you're doing a research project or implementing a project abroad. You're not just doing work in your lab that you're already very familiar with. So a couple things here, you're going to want to start with partnerships very early on. So you're going to want to talk to potential partners, either in the country or other partners who can fill different technical holes on your team. Some teams start forming 2 years in advance, a year in advance, 6 months in advance, so this is something that you really need to start early. You also need to think about operations and personnel considerations. So if you're running a project over in Southeast Asia, that might mean having a field office in Southeast Asia. That might mean a lot of travel for you or for the PI to go to Southeast Asia a lot. So what does that look like in terms of operations? And then for personnel, USAID often requires an external team of personnel to come in and manage these projects on a day-to-day basis. These people will be living and working in the country where your project is being implemented, so you're going to have to hire that team. We recommend posting job descriptions, and in the Q&A we can kind of go into where you can post those and where these people are recruited. But we recommend posting those job descriptions as early as possible and having candidates in mind even before the solicitation comes out, if at all possible. And then finally, you want to consider risk management. Implementing projects and operating internationally is very risky for ASU. There's a lot of legal considerations that anybody at ASU who wants to do this work abroad has to be aware of and has to work within. That isn't to say it's impossible, it just takes a lot of careful planning, and there are teams around ASU who can help you with this. One of them is Global Operations, who I'll reference a number of times in this presentation, and Ashley from Global Ops is online if we have any questions for her at the end. And here I'll have this resource linked at the end of the presentation. There is a risk assessment checklist for international projects housed on Research Administration. So you can pull up this list, you can go through the checklist. It shows you what you need to consider when planning one of these projects. And then you can contact Global Operations to help you think through that checklist and actually plan for things you'll have to consider. Okay, so then this brings us to the USAID solicitation. So when you're reading over a USAID solicitation, kind of the main point of this section is that these do not come out of a central office. These come out of missions and offices all around the world under USAID, so every single one looks a little bit different. This makes them a little bit difficult to read because you're always getting different information, so I really recommend planning to read through the solicitation. I would say 2 to 3 times minimum. Read through it with a highlighter and a pen, take notes on things, highlight things, take note where things might contradict each other, because I see that all the time. And we can talk about how you can actually submit clarifying questions during the Q&A period. So these are the different items that I'm going to go through and what you should look for in the solicitations. And I'm using an example USAID solicitation that will be linked in this presentation if you want to go and reference it later. So looking at eligibility, again, I'm just pulling screenshots of the solicitation out, so this is a real solicitation. So something that you want to check with eligibility is make sure that universities and colleges are actually eligible to apply. USAID does not primarily fund universities. They usually fund other nonprofit organizations. So you always need to double check this. You need to check this with any federal sponsor, but always check it especially for USAID. So here you can see that they explicitly state that we are eligible to apply. And there's some other information. I've seen this statement down here in a lot of proposals as well, and we can come back to that. All right, next you want to check and see what the type of award is going to be. Most of the awards that we at a university will apply for will be grants or cooperative agreements instead of contracts. In the first presentation, I go over what all the different types of awards are, so you can reference that if you're curious. This one I found particularly interesting because they actually say that they are going to award either a grant or a cooperative agreement, and they're going to determine the type on a case-by-case basis. So it's going to depend on the project that you actually propose. This won't change too much how you propose your project, but what it will change is if it is a cooperative agreement, USAID will expect to have a lot more involvement in designing and helping you actually implement that project. Okay, next thing to pay attention to are the deadlines. There are 2 deadlines to keep an eye out for. The first is the deadline for questions. This is the only period where you can interact with USAID, and it is a very limited interaction. Everybody has to submit questions that they have about the solicitation to USAID by this deadline. USAID takes all those questions. They spend about a week to 3 weeks answering those questions, and then they publish that document as an amendment on grants.gov or wherever the solicitation came from. So you don't get to just call up the program officer, you don't get to run ideas by them like you do with some other sponsors. The next deadline that we want to pay attention to is the actual application deadline, and here I really recommend that you check the time zone, again, because these are not coming out of DC, they're not going to be in Eastern time, they're going to be most likely in whatever local time zone is that this is coming out of. So with all of these, usually this converts to a time that is 7 a.m. or sometime in the middle of the night here in Tempe, which means you always have to plan to submit 1 full business day before that deadline. So that way your grants and contracts officer is submitting by 5 p.m. They're not going to submit for you at 3 a.m. in the morning. Okay, next up, we want to look at how you're going to submit the proposal. A lot of federal sponsors will accept proposals through an online web portal like grants.gov or other ones. USAID, I've never submitted a USAID proposal through an online intake form. We've always emailed them, so I'll safely say that that's going to be the most common way of submitting these proposals. That's going to change how you collate and combine all the documents at the end. You'll probably need to put them all into 1 or 2 PDF documents. It's really important to check and see how they want the documents. This one is interesting. I've seen a couple of these. They request both PDF versions and Word versions. So you're going to be sending 2 copies of the same document. And why is this? It's probably because some of their reviewers or some of their office staff do not have access to Adobe, so they have to read them in Word. This is just important to remember. And then with the Word, we just submitted one recently where it had to be a .doc file, so I think that's 2003 and earlier, so it cannot be the .docx file, which is standard now. This one actually asks for newer than 2003. And then here, this is really important, they will sometimes give you a size limit for the emails. This one's 10 megabytes, so that shouldn't be too hard to deal with. We recently had one where it was 2 megabytes per email. We ended up submitting, and this wasn't even for a full proposal, we had to submit 10 different emails in order to get all of our documents in under that 2 megabyte email size. That took about 4 hours of planning and testing and reconfiguring everything. So if this is something that you need to worry about, make sure you plan out the time to actually figure out what that's going to look like in the end. All right, next up, you're going to want to look for operation and staffing requirements. This is not an easy thing to find. There's not one particular section in the solicitation where you're going to find all of this information. This is going to be pulled out of the project description, out of the requirements that they ask for at the proposal, and of the eligibility criteria, essentially the entire solicitation. So I just put one small example of something you'd have to consider up here, and that is some of the staffing requirements, not all of them, but some of them. So here USAID is asking for key personnel. Key personnel are staff positions that, again, USAID wants to have a lot of control over, so they want to be able to approve the candidates that you put forward. And if you ever want to fire or replace these personnel, you need to get explicit agreement from USAID. They also usually write out most of the job descriptions or would approve job descriptions that you write, and they have standard requirements for who can fulfill these. So this one here, they only ask for 1 key personnel, which is a project director, which is essentially a chief of party, which is another term that you'll see often with USAID proposals. And then they say that you can identify up to 4 additional key personnel positions. And then they give you 3 illustrative key personnel positions that you could also consider. When USAID says illustrative, they mean we strongly recommend that you include these. And if you don't, you better have a good reason as to why. So that's just a kind of an implicit thing to know about USAID. All right, next up we're going to look at the proposal requirements. There was more than this in the solicitation, but I just pulled this out for example purposes. This particular application cannot exceed 20 pages. I've seen ones ranging from 10 all the way up to 30 pages. It asks for 12-point font, 1-inch margins. That's pretty standard, but it's always worth double checking because, again, every USAID solicitation has different requirements. Some will talk about what your text box font can be, others won't, so it's just worth looking at all of that. If you have any questions, again, use that Q&A period to get them answered. And then this one gives you an overview of everything that needs to be included in the technical application, as well as the different annexes. And we'll get into those coming up here. All right, finally, we want you to look at the selection criteria and the evaluation criteria. This solicitation had about 3 pages of evaluation criteria, so I just pulled out one example of what it would look like for each section. So this is telling you what your technical approach will be evaluated on. So it's important to make sure you're fulfilling the requirements and also being responsive to the evaluation criteria, both of those. Okay, so now we're going to walk through the different proposal sections. I'm going to touch briefly on some of the more common ones, talk about what commonly goes in there, and then just some tips and tricks as well for how you would write those. So the first one is the technical approach. Here in this one you saw that it was actually titled Analysis and Technical Approach. So that front part, analysis, that's going to need to be in every proposal, whether it's called out explicitly or not. This is essentially where you're going to demonstrate your understanding of the local context. It cannot just be demonstrating an understanding of the technical focus, it needs to be the technical focus in that local context. USAID needs to understand that you can go to another country and that you can operate in that context. You do need to include all of USAID's prescribed activities. As you read through the solicitation, you're going to notice that USAID is very prescriptive in what they want you to do in these projects. They will oftentimes almost just tell you exactly what they want and then suggest that you propose a few more innovative ideas. So you need to make sure that you are including all of their prescribed activities in addition to anything else that you're bringing to the table. And then finally, you need to make sure that you are mirroring USAID's language. By this, we do not mean that you are just parroting back to them what is in the solicitation. What we mean here is that USAID, again, because all of these come out from different offices around the world, they might be choosing language specifically because it is relevant or more accepted in that local context, or because maybe the research in international development in that arena has changed and started to shift. So a couple of examples of this. We used to use the word sustainability a lot. Now the word resiliency is being used a lot more in international development. There's oftentimes language changes with administration changes as well. So I think under the Trump administration, there's a lot larger of an emphasis focusing on, trying to remember what it was, kind of can't remember what it was, but it was essentially empowering countries to do their own work and to do their own development and taking on more of that responsibility. And then one example from this year, we submitted a proposal to implement a project in Malawi, and the project is focusing on improving their online education at the university level. Here, ODL in the United States really means online distance learning, but ODL in Malawi actually means open distance learning. And this is because in Malawi, internet infrastructure in some of the regions is almost non-existent. So even though the main focus of our proposal was online distance learning, and every time we use this word, we almost always meant online distance learning, we had to account for the fact that there were regions, we had to plan activities for these regions where they did not have internet access. So it was a different sort of distance-based learning. Okay, for the management approach, here, you're essentially answering how are you going to implement and manage your technical approach. So this is really the supporting management piece for that previous section. A lot of the things that we talked about thinking about early are going to come into play here. So those partnerships, how are you going to coordinate and supervise your subcontractors or work with your other partners? What are roles and responsibilities for everybody going to be? You need to discuss your operations. How's the communication between your home office and your field office going to work? Is there going to be heavy travel involved? Those different things you'll need to tell USAID. You'll usually have a staffing and personnel section where you go over the qualifications and the skills mix of your personnel for the project. And then finally, a lot of the risk management things that you would go over through that checklist and working with global operations would come into play here too. Okay, the third section that you're going to see in almost all USAID proposals is this institutional capability section. This focuses both on technical and management. It's not just technical. They don't want to just know that you're the best in your research field. They want to actually know that you can also manage the project. This section should really focus on you and your specific team here at ASU. So maybe it's you and your school or your unit. But it can also focus more broadly on ASU's institutional capabilities, so project management, the fact that we have a global operations office who can help us manage these things. It should also focus on your partners and their institutional capabilities as well. Okay, monitoring and evaluation plan. So this is going to be something that is almost always included in USAID proposals. It will either be a section of the technical application itself in summary form. It might be an annex, usually it's a 5-page monitoring and evaluation plan, or it might be requested that you submit this within 90 days of award. I've seen all of those. I've seen a mixture of all of those as well. So this is going to include a couple of things. First off, a theory of change, which I pulled this picture directly from the USAID website. It's one of my favorite pictures because it's cartoonish. Essentially, a theory of change is talking about how are you going to go from the current status to something that's a little bit better. You're going to include a logic model, which some of you who have applied to NSF or Department of Education funding may be a little bit familiar with these. I've seen these popping up there. It's going to talk about what are your inputs, what are your activities, what are your outputs, and what are the impacts of those. That's going to match very closely with your theory of change statement. And then you're also going to be including mandatory and custom indicators. So this is going to be what you're actually going to be measuring throughout your project. Sector by sector, USAID does have mandatory indicators that they require for all projects. This is what is eventually reported back to Congress in order to renew their budget. And then they'll also ask you to think through, okay, your project is unique, it's special, what are some custom indicators that you'll also use to measure? One thing to note, you have to have real numbers. You cannot just say that we're going to monitor the number of participants that we train. You have to say we're going to have 5 workshops, and in each of those workshops we're going to train 30 people, and they're going to develop these 10 skills. And these need to match up with your technical approach, and they need to match up with your budget as well. Okay, key personnel. So this might be in your management plan. This might be a separate section. This will likely have annexes that show CVs and resumes and letters of commitment. One thing here is that you must always show that your candidates that you are proposing to USAID to fill these personnel positions meet and exceed the qualifications needed for that. One easy way to do this, a lot of reviewers like this, is to just have a simple table where in one column you have the requirements for the position, in the other column you specifically show how your candidate meets and exceeds those requirements. So the reviewers can just go through and just check, 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 check. Here, it's important to note that USAID really cares who these key personnel are. Oftentimes, if you're hiring locally, which you hopefully are, USAID will actually know these people. They might know them even better than you do. They will check their references. I've seen a lot of proposals come back and say, your technical looks good, your management looks good, we don't like your chief of party, propose another candidate. We had a project this year where I think it wasn't until the 3rd try that we finally got a chief of party that USAID actually liked and wanted to have on this project. They might even come back and say, you don't have enough women on your team, you need to make sure that you have more female candidates, and we have to go out and find more female candidates then. So this is really good if you can get this right on the first try, because it's pretty hard for us here at ASU to go out and recruit a chief of party in Malawi or somewhere in Southeast Asia. So this is something that you should definitely be thinking about very early on. And then in the annex, you'll usually include resumes and CVs. Those are going to be formatted differently depending on the solicitation. And then the letter of commitment, this indicates that if you receive funding, this person is ready and able to serve as in that position. When you're recruiting these people, you're going to notice that you want to go out and recruit a chief of party. They might be chief of party on another project and they have 1 year left, and then your project would start and they would move into that project. So this is something for USAID to check and see, are you actually talking to candidates who are going to be available for the period of funding, or are you talking to somebody who just got hired on a project but they have 5 years left of their contract? That doesn't seem like they're going to be available. So that's something that you'll have to indicate in those letters. Okay, an annual work plan. This is usually included either as an annex or part of the management plan or implementation plan. It usually looks like a Gantt chart, but there can be other ways of doing it as well. It's going to include startup and closeout activities. Usually USAID asks for an annual breakdown, and then you might break each of those years down either by quarter or by month. For the startup period, that is usually the first 3 months of the project. A lot of people will even break that down by week, and they'll talk about all the startup activities that they have to do in order to implement the activity as quickly as possible. The closeout activities usually happen in the past 6 months or year. This includes everything from selling off your vehicles to closing down your office to doing your final reporting. There's a lot of stuff that happens in that final 6 months. Another thing to note here, be conscious of the local calendar. As with any federal award, usually the start date is flexible. It might depend on the review schedule. It might depend on when the final award is negotiated. So USAID certainly expects that these plans will be edited and changed. But if you're proposing to work with universities in Malawi again, or in Nigeria, I think was what this example was, and you propose a calendar that doesn't match up with the local university calendar at all, it's going to look like you don't know what you're doing. It's just going to be a little bit of a tick against you. So just make sure that you're conscious of all of the local calendaring as well. Okay, and then these are a bunch of other sections. I won't go through these too in depth, but if in the Q&A you want to come back to one of them, I'm more than happy to do so. So the first is the branding and marking plan. This will always be either an annex or will not be requested until you are actually awarded. This is something where you have to tell USAID that you understand their branding and marking rules and that you are committed to branding and marking all of your equipment and project, anything that's tangible. You will essentially mark with the USAID logo and their slogan. So this includes vehicles, this includes your office, business cards, any posters that you might have at events or anything else, banners. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you have to do, but this plan isn't actually that complicated. You really just have to think about all of the tangible things that could essentially be branded. Hopefully they're all in your budget. And then you can just refer to the USAID branding and marking guidelines and tell them that you essentially understand and will implement them. The security plan, this is for if you are operating in a country that might be experiencing some conflict or is not that stable. This is not something that you are going to write. None of us here in this room can write a security plan for one of these projects. This is something that you will let your RA know is a requirement. Your RA, of course, will know that as well. You guys will then work with global operations who can connect you with resources, whether it's a consultant or our risk management office, to help you draft the content for that plan. That's going to include things like how is your office going to be secured? How are you going to be secured with domestic travel? You might have a private car and a driver, and that's how you ensure that your transportation is safe. But again, this is not something that you are going to be expected to write on your own. Letters of commitment and resumes, I already touched on those for key personnel. Past performance information, USAID will usually require 3 to 5 examples of past performance. So this is something that you should check the solicitation for and clarify if you need to. Do they just want USAID projects, or do they want any projects that are sponsored by other sponsors that are similar in scope or size? So check that. And then you can certainly turn in projects from your own group that you've implemented in the past, but you can also turn in projects that ASU has implemented. So maybe you haven't done USAID projects before, but there are plenty of people across the university who have. You can also submit those. Again, they should be similar in technical scope and similar in award size. And you can contact your RA, who can work with our ORSPA team to make sure that you're getting your hands on some of those write-ups. These do include brief summaries of the projects and also include references. So you have to make sure that that contact information is up to date. USAID will contact all of them and actually get these. It's not something that they say they're going to do and not do. They do it. All right, and then the environmental mitigation plan. Occasionally USAID will require this. If your project will have any potentially harmful environmental effects, you'll have to draft a plan on how you're going to mitigate those. There's usually some guidance that USAID provides in the specific solicitations about what kind of content to include in there. And then your gender plan, most USAID solicitations will ask that you demonstrate how you're going to engage and encourage the participation of women in your activities. But perhaps in addition or in place of, they might ask for what's called a gender plan. This is usually a 1 to 2 page write-up of how you're going to do a gender analysis of what the current status in the country is, and then how you're going to encourage participation of women in your project. Okay, so next we're going to talk about considerations for cost proposals. And just to give you guys a small sample of the different things you should have to think about when you're preparing your budget, put all of these up here. I promise you that we're not going to go through each and every single one. During the Q&A period, we can come back to this slide and we can talk about any that you guys have questions of. I'm guessing if you're like me, there might be some up here that you don't even know what they are. That's kind of the main message that I have is when you're budgeting for these projects, again, it's not as simple as just budgeting in faculty time and the equipment that you're already very familiar with in your lab. There's a lot of things that you have to consider. But I have a 3-step plan for getting you to write a really good budget, and here it is. It's very simple. Work with your RA. They're going to be your biggest resource. They know how to do these budgets. They can turn to Raz, who's done tons of USAID budgets, to ask these questions. Your RA will connect you with global operations, who can help you think through all of these things. They can help you get quotes. They can raise things that you haven't even thought of before. And then finally, work with your partners. If you have a local on-the-ground partner, if you have a partner who has a headquarters office in DC but has field offices in the country where you're going to be working, they are already going to have a lot of this information. They're going to know where you should put your office. They're going to know how much your office rent will be. They're going to have a lot of this information already. So make sure you're talking to them and letting them know that you're new to budgeting and you're going to need a lot of help. Okay, so we're getting towards the end here. So I just want to point out some of the resources that I referenced and point out a couple more. So this top link here under ASU is going to connect you to Global Operations. Here you can get their email and their contact information to reach out and have a conversation. You can also get access to an entire documents library that is continually being updated. They have tons of resources in there to walk you through all of the different international operations considerations. You can also go to Research Admin and access the International Risk Considerations Checklist. We also have a unit here in KED that is called International Development. They do a lot of business development for the university in international development. They have a lot of contacts with partners headquartered in DC and can facilitate those connections. So it's worth reaching out to them as well if you're interested in doing a project abroad. They can help you get started on that. And then finally, RA Help. This email address will connect you to Raz, who's going to be able to help answer a lot of questions that you have. And then under USAID, there's a link here that'll take you to a page called How to Work with USAID. There's a lot of training content on there. You can either watch their about 30-minute modules, or you can download the PDFs of them. They have some templates. They have resources that'll walk you through how to write a MEL plan, monitoring and evaluation plan, all sorts of stuff. And then again, I have the business forecast for USAID linked. This is something that's always worth checking in on periodically just to see where opportunities are. And then finally, a link to the different country strategies as well. Okay, so upcoming events. We are launching something called Proposal Development Workshops 2.0. I think that's the tentative name. It may become the permanent name. This is going to be a follow-on series to all of the workshops that we do in the fall. These workshops are going to be a little bit more in-depth and detailed, and there's one coming up in January titled Going Global from Proposal to Implementation. I'm going to be working with Ashley Haygood, who's again from Global Operations and online, and we're going to be talking about what you do once you actually win a USAID award and you have to go and implement it. What does that look like? And then Global Operations is also sponsoring some USAID workshops. They're going to be bringing in a consultant who does excellent training on different USAID topics. They're going to be having those from February 27th through March 1st. They're going to get them up on Research Academy so you can register for the individual sessions. But for now, you can reach out to them at the email address if you have any questions. Okay, and then I will break and we can just open it up for any questions or if people want to go back and discuss things more in depth.
I think it's probably dependent, but the key personnel, are they usually people in the target area that have the university, the academic community, or are they typically
So I'm just going to repeat the question for everybody online. So the question was about key personnel and who they are, if they're hired from the academic community or if they come from somewhere else. So it is project dependent, of course, as you guessed. Once you start recruiting key personnel, there's a few different positions that are pretty standard. Chief of party or project director, this is going to be the leader of the project. There might be a deputy chief of party. There's going to be a monitoring and evaluation position, and then other technical positions depending on the project. So you're going to start to notice that in the USAID community, there's actually a pretty small group of people who have chief of party experience, and whoever you hire for a chief of party has to already have previous chief of party experience. So you're going to find that they might already be in country, and then if it's a university-related project, they might have university experience, but honestly, we don't usually hire chief of parties who come from academic positions. And so you're just going to find them either in the country again, otherwise there's LinkedIn groups for these people and they might be coming from another region of the world as well, and you're hiring them for their technical expertise. So it might either be technical expertise, it might be geographic focus, or it might be a mixture of the two. And that kind of flows down for all the different positions as well. And again, it's also going to depend on if you need somebody to speak the local language, you're probably going to hire them from in-country. But you might have somebody who speaks that language but is currently in China working on another project or something too. Does that help? Okay. And I can go in just a quick follow-on to that. In terms of posting the positions, there is a global hire form on the Global Operations website that you would fill out to help get those hires approved. These hires are conditional on funding and approval from USAID. So you're not hiring somebody before you actually get the funding, which is good to know. And then you would actually draft up a job description, you'd come up with a salary range, and then you could go out and post that on different recruiting websites. DevX is one of the really big international development job posting websites that also has a lot of content. We post most of our positions there. There are LinkedIn groups specifically for chiefs of party and other USAID personnel where you can post them. And then we'd also recommend just sharing them with your partners and having them do a lot of recruiting for you as well. Yeah. Any other questions?
How do you determine which award to go after? And how many are there to choose from?
Sure. So the business forecast, I have not looked at it recently. I think when I've looked at it in the past, there's over 100 different opportunities on there at any given time. Every sector under USAID and every different office is going to get a pool of money. They use those 5-year strategic plans to plan out how they're going to spend that money. So the way you would go about picking which opportunities to go after, you would look at them and say, does that project match with my own technical focus? Does that match with my area of research? Can I fill in any of the holes that I have with partners? And then you'd also look at the geographic location. If it's in Southeast Asia and you've never worked in Southeast Asia before, maybe you want to wait for one that's in Latin America where you usually work. Or maybe you're ready to jump and you're ready to go and implement this in Southeast Asia because you have such great technical expertise. So again, it's that mix of technical expertise and geographic experience that would guide where you're looking at. And if you don't have that experience in Southeast Asia, maybe you have an on-the-ground partner who has a lot of experience there and will fill in that hole for you. Does that help? Yeah.
Is it a bandwidth issue? In other words, if you could do more, you would do more?
Yeah, I think so. And the other thing to remember too is when we are running these projects as a university, we have faculty who teach classes, they have other research projects, they have service commitments, and so their bandwidth to manage these projects is pretty limited. So you need to make sure that you have a strong group of personnel on the ground to manage it for you, but you also have to think through, are you going to have to travel to this location 2 or 3 or 4 times a year? Can you do that with your teaching schedule? So there are a lot of considerations, and it does mostly come down to bandwidth. That's what we mostly hear from faculty. When the ID group sends out business opportunities and proposal opportunities, a lot of the feedback that they get is, this is a pretty huge lift, and sometimes faculty have time and sometimes they don't. Mm-hmm.
Really big on getting the community around the project and keeping them there, so after your 5 years done, your funding's done, you leave, you don't come back, they're not going back to their original ways or whatever.
Yep.
I don't think I remember you mentioned something like that aside from resilience.
Mm-hmm.
So is that a big thing in the USA, or?
Yes, so I'll repeat. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So he was wondering, how much do you have to talk about what's going to happen after the project funding period ends? Do you have to talk to USAID about what it's going to look like after that, kind of the sustainability idea? So yes, you do. They might explicitly call it out and ask you to touch on that. And if they don't, as you noted in international development, that is a huge concern. What happens when the money goes away? Do you just leave the communities and they go back to whatever it was before? So you do have to talk about that. Again, it might explicitly be called out as a sustainability or resiliency plan. If it's not, it still is something that you need to touch on. This is where local partnerships are going to be a big deal, because a lot of the USAID projects that you will be doing, especially as a university where learning and training is such a core part of who we are, a lot of your projects are going to include training components where you're working with local organizations and local individuals to train up skills. So potentially after you leave, they'll still have the skills to continue the project. Some of our projects have even talked about finding private partnerships in order to continue the funding after the projects, or other ways of helping the communities find their own funding afterward. Yeah. Any other questions? I'll go really quickly back to this slide. Are there any things on the cost considerations for cost proposal slide that you guys just have no clue what they are and want me to briefly explain? Danger pay. I know, I wanted to blow that one up really big. So danger pay, trying to think about how to simply explain it because I don't even know myself. Danger pay is the idea that if you're sending workers abroad to work in areas that are conflict zones or might be considered dangerous, so this is going to apply to people who work for USAID, to people who work for the State Department, anybody else who's abroad as well, you might pay them extra to be in those dangerous locations. So there are standard rates that we use. They're set by the Department of State. Those are just the same guidelines that we use. And it's a percentage of the pay that you're getting. So if you're going to Afghanistan and you're getting X amount in salary, on top of that, you're going to get a certain percentage of danger pay for being in that unsafe location. So we do have this on USAID projects that we do even here. There's a lot of this EPO expenses and some of the personnel global benefits. This is going to come into play when if you're hiring people to work internationally, we will not always hire them as direct hires to ASU. There's a lot of rules about whether or not ASU can operate internationally. We are a state entity. There's a state constitution that governs how we operate. So oftentimes we cannot have bank accounts abroad and we cannot have personnel abroad. So we might use what is called, oh, Ashley, I'm forgetting the name of this, but you'll know it, so type it if you know it. EPO stands for employment, or maybe it's PEO, this is why I'm confused. It's PEO, Private Employment Organization Expenses. So sorry about that typo there. So you would actually pay a third-party firm who specializes in hiring personnel abroad to hire on behalf of ASU.
Ashley says it's Professional Employer Organization.
Thank you. Professional Employer Organization. There's other things like local taxes and VAT. These are huge considerations. USAID will not pay for VAT. ASU will not pay for VAT. So who pays for the VAT? These are things that you have to work through. The vehicle and driver, oftentimes in other countries you cannot take public transportation. It's just going to be too long or not convenient enough. So you might actually have to purchase a vehicle as part of your project plan. And then with that vehicle, you usually purchase the services of a driver. You don't drive that vehicle yourself. And that plays partly into the security piece as well. Okay.
I have, so I guess on one end of the spectrum I have a research idea I want to apply in some other country, and I'm just going to go apply. And then the other end of the spectrum you have no idea what you want to apply. You have some research ideas, and you go and figure out, what are the countries asking for. Where along that spectrum do most projects fall? If we have an idea that's more on the first end, is that not a good idea? Like, does USAID not like things where you typically have a research idea and you're kind of trying to figure out a country to put it in? I know you said a lot of times their proposals are almost like, we have an idea, spruce it up a little bit and spit it back to us and put some, slap some people on it and we'll call it a project. Is that what most of them end up being? Are we kind of, chasing a bad project if we're more on the first end?
Yeah, I would say that USAID is usually pretty prescriptive in what they want. They usually know what they want. So if you do just have a research idea and you're looking for a place to fit it in, it's going to be a long time before the perfect opportunity comes your way. But I do have another solution for you though. Again, get in contact with the International Development Group. They work with a lot of our partners, and one way for faculty to work with USAID and to build that experience is to actually be a subcontractor to another organization who's doing a larger project. So you would only be responsible for a very tiny piece, just whatever your research interest is. So you might go in and you might do some monitoring and evaluation, you might do some training, something that's specific to you, And you're not worrying about hiring personnel, you're not worrying about managing the project, you are just doing your thing as part of that larger organization. And then from there, that could then build into other things. And we have a number of faculty here who are really successful at being those subs to larger organizations. And they find that that's a really good way to do it.
And when you say international development group, when you get in contact with that, who are you talking about?
So those are, let me go back here. This is their website, internationaldevelopment.asu.edu.
Okay.
If you click on that, they are a business development unit of KED, the Knowledge Enterprise Development, and they have staff in DC as well as here on Tempe's campus, and they track opportunities and they try and find faculty to match those opportunities.
Okay.
Whether it's us leading the project, which is what I talked about, or it's you going to an organization probably headquartered in DC and being just a small piece of their project.
Thank you.
Yeah. Tobin, did you have a question? Okay. All right. Any last call for questions, and then we'll go ahead and end. Anything online? Okay. One more. Go for it.
Do you feel there's a certain amount of accomplishment that you get from working with USAID?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. So one thing to note about USAID is they're more focused on implementing projects. It's not just research in your lab. It's not just advancing an idea with just a small group of researchers that you're working with. You're going out and you're actually doing projects that are affecting people, and you're hopefully training them and giving them more skills. So it's a bigger idea than just doing research in your lab that might take years and years and years to be implemented into something that ends up affecting people. Of course it does. Everything is working towards that goal, but USAID is very hands-on. It's very implementation focused.
What are typical budget ranges for your project? Is it like NIH where it's $300K to $5 million, somewhere in between? Is it more on the lower end, more on the higher end? Again, it's project dependent because you're working in different countries, so salaries are going to change, et cetera. But where do they typically fall?
Our office, research development, we work on projects that have a threshold of $1 million in budget or above annually. But those are the projects that I see. That's not the full scope of USAID projects. So you could find smaller ones. A lot of the big countrywide projects that I kind of referenced, those were in the ballpark of somewhere between 5 to 15 million, probably over 5 years. If you're going to just go and do a subcontract to a larger organization who's implementing the whole project, that might look like $200,000 to $300,000 for just a single faculty member to go and work with them. If that gives you, and I've seen other ones that range from $500,000 to $1 million. Those are smaller projects. The big ones are going to be a lot more. Yeah. Okay, we'll go ahead then and let everyone go. And again, we'll email out the presentation and I'll send out the USAID Workshop 1 and 2. And if you have time on January 15th, I highly recommend that you attend this next step proposal workshop about talking about implementation. So thanks everyone and have a good Tuesday.